Welcome to another episode of the Swamp247 Podcast. I'm your host, Graham Hall, joined today by my co-hosts Tyler Harden and Zach Goodall. And it's been a busy week in Gainesville for the Florida Gators. Early signing day was Wednesday through Friday. Florida has hired a pair of coordinators and Tulane coach Jon Sumrall, who soon will be headed to Gainesville, but not too soon, as the Green Wave are headed to the college football playoff against Ole Miss in Oxford, where Tulane will be a heavy underdog, but it's certainly going to be an interesting matchup, a rematch of an earlier contest this season between Tulane and Ole Miss, and certainly Coach Jon Sumrall's team is looking to get revenge from that loss to begin the season early on here. But we're going to jump right into it and talk about some of the coordinator moves, talk with Tyler about early signing day, what he likes about the class, what he made of the flips, and who he thinks could see the field early and make an early impact in Gainesville, albeit under a new staff. So let's recap just how the last week for Florida's new incoming coaching regime played out really quickly. Jon Sumrall identified Brad White from Kentucky as his defensive coordinator. That move makes a whole lot of sense. You look at the Wildcats defense in Lexington under Brad White. They had 4 top 25 defenses over the past 8 years under White's leadership, put a lot of players in the league, which Zach and I talked about in our last episode here. And that move was finalized rather quickly. It's actually the first coordinator hire that has been finalized for Jon Sumrall's staff, and he's now changed his Twitter bio, presumably going to be on the road recruiting here, helping land transfer portal targets here in the next couple of weeks. But the one that had Florida fans the most excited was arguably the biggest hire that Jon Sumrall had to make. If you go back to that opening statement that Sumrall released upon his hiring in Gainesville, he addressed that having an elite offensive coordinator to call the plays, to bring back an explosive offense in Gainesville. I believe he called it mandatory for Florida to have an explosive offense. That assuaged any concerns, fears that people could have had that Florida was going to hire another coach who was intent on calling their own plays, which if you followed the Florida Gators, as everyone out there has, for the previous 4 years of the Billy Napier era, that was the most common complaint of his coaching, was his intention to call the plays. You go back to his introductory press conference upon his arrival in Gainesville, and he said that he intended to call the plays because he believed it gave Florida an advantage on the field. And now, 4 years later, we have seen that that did not really come to fruition whatsoever. That may be an understatement. You know, while we're not going to focus too much on Billy Napier due to the current era and where Florida is moving toward, Napier was back in the headlines this week. He was hired at James Madison to take over a 12-1 team that found its way moving into the college football playoff in pretty dramatic fashion. Duke took on Virginia in the ACC championship. Duke won in overtime, which meant that James Madison leapt Virginia as the 5th highest ranked conference championship winner. And now James Madison and Tulane are headed to the college football playoff. And I noted this on social media. I think it's pretty fascinating that Florida's former coach is taking over a college football playoff team, and its incoming coach is coaching in the college football playoff. So a lot of interest there when it pertains to the Gators, even though they certainly were a far way away from making the college football playoff themselves. With all that said, the majority of this podcast is going to talk about the additions from the player side in Gainesville, and that focuses on early signing day. Tyler did a terrific job, not just this past week, but throughout the past 8 months of tracking all the moves, following the commitments, watching players in person, scouting, recapping. I mean, Tyler, you must have been exhausted, man, because it certainly was a whirlwind, especially when you add in the factor of a coaching change and how quiet things were on Florida's front since Billy Napier's firing. But with all that said, Florida has added 19 players to its roster after Wednesday through Friday. They didn't all sign on Wednesday. There were a couple that chose to take it out to Friday, even if there were no concerns. Tyler, for everyone out there, we want to just get your thoughts on this class, what you make of the additions, how Florida was able to keep the majority of its prospects in the fold, and how you think Florida fared signing 19 prospects on early signing day.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, there was a lot of caffeine consumed, energy drinks, coffee, albeit, people on the board know that for sure. But no, I mean, just the signing day as a whole for Florida was, impressive, remarkable in some ways, just how the class, stuck together and everything. And just, because you look around the country at programs like LSU, Penn State, Auburn, UCLA, that wasn't the case, right? They lost a lot of, commitments in November and things like that. So Florida kind of being an exception, somewhat of an exception to that, current trend of college football. I mean, this isn't the only year we've seen, coaching changes around the country, and, there seems to be mass exoduses around the country when that happens. And, that wasn't the case at Florida. So it's pretty remarkable to see how they kind of dodged that bullet in a way and, allowed this class to, end the way it did, which is, pretty, top 16, top 20 class, that's pretty great. And, all things considered.
Yeah. And Tyler, to that point, like most of the class stuck together, they did end up losing 2 commitments, right? And they added 1 as well. So I guess kind of a give and a take, but I'd be curious for your stance on each of those moves. Dylan Purter being the flip from LSU, which I know Florida fans had a lot of fun with, if only because of the Lane Kiffin LSU aspect of it. But also the 2 losses in Carson Baker, the running back, and you'll have to help me with his name, Kekua Amua.
Yeah, Kekua Amua.
Yeah, I mean,
yeah.
So I'm not trying to like take anything away from those 2 players at all. But to me, those 2 were kind of representative of the offenses Billy Napier tried to build here. I mean, Amua was a tight end that I'm sure you've probably seen a lot more of his film than I have, but from what I saw was like more of a blocking kind of tight end, kind of the prospect that last staff really tried to focus in on. And Carson Baker, obviously, they really prided themselves on pulling in running backs. And now I don't think they have one in this class. I'm curious if they'd attack the portal, but just your overall thoughts on those 3 moves, the addition and the 2 subtractions from an otherwise pretty stable class.
Yeah, I think you hit it right on the head there. I mean, they're definitely kind of remnants of what Napier was trying to build on the offensive side of the ball with the 2026 class. And yeah, let's start with Carson Baker here. I mean, just from a recruiting standpoint, that was, well, I guess you could say with both of Florida's decommitments, it was kind of like a gradual fade away from Florida. I mean, Carson Baker throughout the entirety of the post-Napier era through this fall was taking visits elsewhere, visited Georgia Tech, visited Kentucky, Ole Miss, North Carolina, South Carolina. He was clearly open to other options. He would always say, yeah, I'm committed to Florida. I'm locked in with Florida. But he was always open, and he made that known. Obviously, not only the visits, he would say, I'm open to other options. I want to hear other schools out. And it just seemed like a matter of time before, one of those visits would really click and really kind of, take over the driver's seat. And, in a lot of ways that school was South Carolina. South Carolina, after they had the last OV of the fall, they were in position to probably flip him. Then Texas A&M, seemingly out of nowhere, comes in and flips him. I'd imagine that was largely due on the NIL side of things, that they came in with a late offer and swung him away from, Florida and those other schools he visited throughout the fall. So it was a matter of time for him. And, you could say the same thing about Kekua Amua. They call him Rhino, of course. He used to play at IMG Academy. He played there for his junior season, went back to his home state of Hawaii for his senior season. And, after Napier was fired, he took an OV to Washington, seemingly closer to home, definitely closer to home for him, a lot closer to home than Florida. So, once he took that visit, it was that kind of raised the flags there of like, hey, it's going to be hard to, beat out Washington. He has a great relationship with the tight ends coach over there. It's a more stable coaching situation, just kind of calling a spade there. And it was a recruitment definitely that had to do with, distance to home, right? He took a last minute OV to Auburn. Auburn landed a tight end right after. They were kind of in and out of his recruitment, but Washington was always the one that kind of built momentum, slowly but surely in, that post-Napier era to flip Almua. And then, you look over to the addition side of things with Dylan Purter. I mean, that was a great addition when it just comes to, what they're getting in the secondary commits with, not only Purter, but Caden Hall. They really complement their games really well. I mean, Purter, he comes in with the speed. He weighs, 182. I believe on our site, we had him at 165 for a little while. So, definitely on the lighter side of things and definitely, fleet-footed type of thing. And you come in with Caden Hall, he could borderline, put on weight and become a linebacker, right? He's 6'3", 195. Definitely plays more of like that Isaiah Simmons type of role. So they definitely complement each other well. And yeah, I mean, it was, definitely drew some headlines with the LSU to Florida flip, just the ironic, sense there. But yeah, I mean, definitely kind of two definitely different situations when it came to the decommitments and the addition Florida made.
Looking at the Florida roster side of things, the Gators added 3 running backs a year ago, landing Chad Gasper Jr., who didn't contribute this year, was coming back from a significant knee injury. He was actually added as a preferred walk-on on Florida's roster. He understood that the 2025 season would be more about getting healthy, developing. And then Florida added Byron Lewis and Waltez Duke Clark. And Clark was able to see the field as a freshman, and at least where things stand right now, all 3 of those players are going to come back. So losing a running back a year after adding 3, when you also have Jaden Baugh, who, as Zach has reported over at Swamp247, is someone that Florida feels really good about getting back. They have identified him as a primary guy that they're looking to add back to this roster after his 1,000-plus yard rushing season, where he had more than 260 rushing yards in the season finale. Losing a running back, given the numbers, given the fact that you could have 5 guys coming back with Katie Daniels and the 3 guys I just mentioned, it really makes that not a huge blow. And I'll say this about Baker also, without trying to criticize him in any way, but I think the writing was, like you mentioned, Tyler, really on the wall for Florida fans. I go back to that loss at Kentucky for Florida when the Gators go into Lexington and they're just outright embarrassed. They lose 38-7. And adding insult to injury, in a sense, is that Baker is posting photos at Kentucky, debating his decision there. And that's more than a month out from early signing day. So you add that in with the South Carolina visit. It was clear that he was entertaining offers elsewhere, even though he was staying committed. So, and that was an outlier compared to the rest of Florida's commits. They weren't necessarily posting visit photos elsewhere. They were staying relatively quiet, as you certainly experienced, Tyler. So the writing was all on the wall there. And without going too much into Kukua, there's no Florida fan out there that's going to lose sleep about Florida not adding another tight end. I mentioned the offensive play calling for Billy Napier, but the scheme with the usage of 12 personnel when they had all this talent at the skill positions was one of the consistent gripes that Florida fans had. And then I go back to the numbers also. Florida added 2 tight ends last year in Cameron Kosman and Micah Jones, 2 guys who hardly saw the field. I don't think they played more than a handful of snaps. Cameron had a shoulder injury that he was dealing with. Micah was injured as well during the 2025 season. You lose Hayden Hansen, but the guys that you're getting back, you look at, the numbers that Florida has at tight end, that's not a huge blow whatsoever to Florida's position room. So minimal damage there in terms of flips compared to what we have seen in years past. I mean, you go back to when the end of the Dan Mullen era, you saw double-digit players exit the class. You saw a lot of attrition. You saw really a lot of attrition each year under Billy Napier as they look to retool the roster. And as of right now, December 8th, as we record this podcast, even though the transfer portal's not open yet, you haven't seen anyone announce their intention to leave. So the attrition process has not started yet for Florida, and that definitely was not the case on the recruiting trail. But when you talk about recruits, fans are admittedly not that patient. They want to sign blue chip prospects who can see the field early, can contribute at a high rate, because with the portal, you never know how long you're going to have someone on the roster. It could be 1 year, it could be 5 years. They want to see at least trending in the direction that they could see the field early. And I know it's too early to project really how guys could crack the depth chart and play a role, especially with a new staff coming in. But Tyler, I want to get your take on this from watching them in person, looking at their film, and identifying maybe some positions both in Gainesville and historically that have been able to play an early role upon entering college. Who are some of the guys in this class, in your opinion, kind of putting you on the spot here, that you think could see the field or at least vie for a role to play early during their time at Florida? Whether it's someone like a Jaden Woods, who last year came in, was a little bit unheralded, and then ends up being a huge piece of Florida's edge rotation, or someone like, a Vernell Brown or a Dallas Wilson, who was identified really early by the end of spring as someone who could be an instant impact contributor. If there's anyone, in your opinion, who could do that, where they could, as a true freshman, be able to see the field, who are some of the guys that stand out to you so far?
Yeah, so I mean, in a way, you have to take what I say with a grain of salt, being that there's a new, staff in Gainesville for this coming season. I mean, the way they approach things could be completely different from, how Napier coached things. I mean, for Florida fans, I'd expect, better or worse. That might not be a bad thing, type of thing. So, I mean, we'll start on the offensive side of the ball. When it comes to, receivers playing early, with Napier, he was no stranger to that. Freshmen were no stranger to getting on the field early as, true freshman receivers. So I look to, Marquez Daniel, just based on how he complements, guys like Vernell Brown and Dallas Wilson, who are more like, speedy guys who, vertical threats, get downfield really, really well. Marquez Daniel, he's such a mismatch, at 6'5", 195. It's going to be really interesting to see how he, gets under the, Florida system, in this offseason, how he progresses in the weight room and just, under a collegiate system, how he kind of, develops on that side. Assuming things go well on that side going into the fall, I expect him, to be, a threat over time that could provide that mismatch that Florida hasn't really had, this season at receiver. So, that's a guy I'm looking to as well. But, jumping over to the defensive side of the ball, two guys that really catch my eye is, are CJ Brona. Just because of his speed at the corner position. I mean, he's a 100-meter, 200-meter gold medalist. He's one of the faster guys in the country in the 2026 class. So just based off what he offers, just off a natural skill set, I feel like it's going to be hard for, Florida staff to keep him off the field early. And then, I look to Caden Hall, kind of like I mentioned earlier. Just what he provides from a size standpoint at the safety position and just his versatility. They could do so much with him, drop him down to a linebacker nickel type of package. It's, there's a lot on the table for Caden Hall as well. And I believe he was overlooked this cycle as well. So those are three guys I'm really looking to see if they can, kind of develop and, play it early as freshmen.
Yeah, I think that Florida fans are certainly eager to see who could see the field early on. Obviously, like you mentioned, a new staff coming in, they're going to have different opinions about evaluations. And with the transfer portal opening January 2nd, you got to see how some of this attrition shakes out and who Florida ends up adding via the transfer portal. Anytime you hire a new coach, they've evaluated prospects in the portal or looked at them throughout the year, and they may just have different, methods that they go about communicating and needs that they see as a fit compared to the former staff. So that's certainly going to change things as well. Tyler's going to continue covering recruiting. Obviously, National Signing Day, even though it's lost its luster compared to 6-7 years ago, it still is certainly an interesting thing. Yeah, I got to appeal to the kids in there. It certainly is. It certainly is. Another window that could be more significant when you talk about a new staff, because they'll actually have time to go out and evaluate the roster. They'll have seen the attrition happen in the portal. And maybe there's some guys that they have made inroads with and communicated with who didn't plan on signing until that first week in February. So Tyler's going to continue. He's going to have a busy January. Certainly we'll be evaluating the portal, writing up all the players who exit, tracking them as well, and who Florida is able to retain, because that is arguably the most significant part of the incoming coaching staff's mission right now, is to retain the young talent that they want to keep. Whether it's, Jaden Baugh, like we mentioned, or, a guy like Jaden Woods. Miles Graham looks like he's really bought in. You saw him taking photos with Jon Sumrall when Sumrall was here on Monday of last week. Guys like, obviously, Vernell Brown III, Dallas Wilson, Mekhi Barrow, all the guys I just mentioned who were at Jon Sumrall's introductory press conference, which is a really good sign. Obviously, things could change. DJ Lagway was there as well. But those are players that you look at, and based on their usage in 2025, could be key returnees for Florida. Before we get out of here, Zach, I want to get your take on what the week ahead could look like for Florida. Jon Sumrall was back in Gainesville briefly, and it could lead to a situation, even though he's preparing for his team in the college football playoff, this is a week off. There's no games this upcoming weekend, much to the chagrin of everyone out there who a lot of people would like to see games continue to be played, these first-round games, but there is a lull in action here, which for a new staff could allow them additional time to build their new staffs, start identifying players of need that they think they want to retain. Zach, what do you think this next week is going to look like for the Florida Gators coaching staff under Jon Sumrall?
Yeah, it's been reported that Sumrall is back in town, at least to start this week, and that Tulane is, as they do, lifts, workouts, not so much practicing quite yet, is really like player-driven, player-led as he's gone for the time being. It sounds as though he'll be going back either today when we record this on Monday or maybe Tuesday. And in that time frame, while he's here, I think it's the time where they start putting together their assistant staff, or at least zeroing in on candidates that they want to be here, because while he's coaching through at least next weekend, not this upcoming, but the one after, it would benefit him to have a couple more coaches here doing their evaluations for National Signing Day, obviously, in 2 months from now or just under. But more importantly, the transfer portal. Really helps to have Dave Caldwell in, obviously, as the general manager, who I'm sure is spearheading that effort. But they want to, identify the types of players that they want should they go into the portal. Not even necessarily who they will target, but positions of need, and positions they think that they can bolster here in the coming weeks, especially as we've been recording this show this morning, I've already seen a couple of players announce their intentions to enter the transfer portal. So that board is going to start stacking up. And I would imagine that those are the two biggest efforts while he's here, is making sure everything's on the same page with Caldwell and company, his coordinators. I would think that we'll probably get Buster Faulkner announced here at some point soon. And then we should see some assistant staff, whether it's people being retained. I wrote a story yesterday or on Saturday of a couple coaches that could be retained on Florida staff currently, but also there's a lot more out there that they're going to need to fill in, because I would imagine most of the staff is not going to be retained in Gainesville. So getting that all kind of cohesive and ready to go as they prepare for the portal, and really knocking down their evaluations of the roster. You mentioned retention as well. That's something that they were doing from day one. Even as soon as they got here, they were starting to meet with players. It's my impression that they've met with players a little bit more diligently about the contract aspect of it. So for all we know, if Florida's going to start losing players to the portal, we could even see some in the next coming weeks at least announce again their intentions to enter the portal, now that some of these things are starting to be figured out. So a balancing act, a lot of different priorities, obviously tough for Jon Sumrall as he's coaching two teams effectively. But that's why he's here, is to make sure that all the ducks are in a row before he gets back here full time.
Yeah, hopefully he has a chance to get some sleep, because the guy has been busy for this entire 2025 as he's worked his way into becoming Florida's new head coach while continuing to lead a Tulane team headed to the college football playoff. There was a story that came out that he said he hasn't got more than 4 hours of sleep in the past couple of weeks, and he's got a lot more work to do. And, not just hiring on-field assistant coaches, but behind the scenes, recruiting personnel, figuring out who he wants to retain. You mentioned Dave Caldwell. He's going to be in that GM NFL style role, but presumably Florida's still going to look to hire, assistant director or a director of player personnel, the role that Jacob LaFrance was in. And now LaFrance is headed to Harrisonburg, Virginia, to reunite with Billy Napier for the second time. A guy who did a really good job, in my opinion, in helping Florida secure a lot of impressive recruiting classes during his time. And obviously Napier thought that he was a wise addition to get on board. Napier made that hire before Florida has made a hire of who's going to lead their player personnel department, whether it's for Florida, Cole Hurd, or someone else out there. That addition I expect to happen in the near future, along with those on-field assistants that you mentioned. So we'll continue tracking that over at Swamp247. There's going to be a lot of movement coming, and not just this week, but the weeks ahead. And I got to get out of here by saying what I say every single week. If you're looking to actually see some competitive action, Florida basketball suffered a loss to Duke last Tuesday, rallied from 15 points down, but couldn't complete the comeback. A late three-pointer sent Florida to their third loss of the season. And now Florida sits here at 5-3, heading into a highly anticipated matchup tomorrow night at Madison Square Garden in the Jimmy V Invitational. Florida takes on UConn. For the second time in 9 months, the Gators took on UConn in the second round of the NCAA tournament in Raleigh, North Carolina, and Florida rallied in that game and won 77-75. So a meeting between the two most recent national championship winners in UConn and Florida is Tuesday night in New York City. Get some sleep before that game, take a nap, whatever you got to do, because that's going to be a 9:30 contest. Clemson and BYU play in the first game of the Jimmy V Invitational. And if you know how those things go, that means that the second game is probably going to tip off a little bit later. So expecting that to be a 9:30-ish tip-off at Madison Square Garden. I'll be up there covering it for Swamp247, so we'll have a ton of content. I've got a Boogie Flan feature coming, a UConn preview as well, and I'm looking forward to getting up there for the first time at Madison Square Garden. But that's going to do it for this episode of the Swamp247 Podcast. I want to thank Tyler for joining us for this episode to break down early signing day. Zach, who's going to continue tracking all of Florida's coaching staff moves, and we'll be handling transfer portal content and anything else that pops up and that we can continue to bring our subscribers coverage of over at Swamp247. But again, that's going to do it for Tyler Harden and Zach Goodall. I'm Graham Hall, and we'll see you next time.